Welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone managed to get some coffee and discuss some of the topics raised this afternoon. If you haven't already, please do open up Slido on your phone and using the code WeAreSustainable, all one word, and soon we're going to have a new poll question which will be discussed during the session. It's now time to hear a local angle on biodiversity finance and climate change. In our next session, regulatory perspectives on the twin crises. The Guernsey Financial Services Commission, the island's regulator, recently released consultations on mitigating greenwashing and a potential natural capital fund kite mark. To talk about both these themes, please welcome the GFSC Director General William Mason and the Director of Investment, Fiduciary and Pensions Division, Gillian Browning. Welcome, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Steph. So, William and I are here to provide a regulatory perspective on what we consider to be the twin crisis, that of climate change and degradation of nature. Our session is going to be divided into three. Firstly, William and I are going to cover a background to the GFSC's role, our approach, and a summary of our past, present and future actions. Then Josephine's going to compare a question and answer session for us. And finally, there's going to be an interactive element building on the Slido question from before lunch, before the break, just now, and there's going to be a further question to follow. So in terms of who the GFSC are, as a scene setter for those of you less familiar with us, we are the financial services regulator for the bailiwick, and our objective, as you might expect, includes protecting investors, preventing financial crime and maintaining financial stability. But we're also conscious that Guernsey is often a jurisdiction of choice, and it's really important that we, as the regulator, provide an environment where innovation and good business flourish. Encouraging innovation is an ongoing commitment from us. And as part of this Sustainable Finance Week, we're offering a Meet the Regulator session at the GFSC tomorrow, and it's not too late to book your place. Spaces are still available for tomorrow, or you can catch William and I after this at the drinks reception. Now, Guernsey's finance sector is material. The investment sector alone administers over 850 funds worth over £300 billion. And they administer approximately the same value again in structures that aren't collective investment schemes, because they might be single asset or single investor vehicles. Now, much of this capital is already deployed in sustainable finance. And some of this is via the Guernsey Green Fund, which was mentioned earlier, which currently has around £5 billion worth of assets under management. Now, it's perhaps stating the obvious, but when we're talking about such material figures, values of capital that Guernsey is administering, the potential for us all collectively in the jurisdiction to support sustainable finance is enormous. In terms of our approach to sustainable finance, we all have limited resources, including a finite number of man-hours. But at the GFSC, we've deliberately targeted our limited resources to focus on sustainable finance, whether that's the development of our sustainable finance policy, or supporting local businesses, the local finance sector, in our collective transition towards a lower carbon economy. Now, no regulator's speech would be complete if we didn't talk about risk. We love talking about risk as regulators. So forgive me while I just give you a broad insight into some of this emerging risk landscape for us. We're already very familiar with risk areas such as conduct risk, prudential risk, governance risk, operational risk, and those things are still very valuable, and we need to maintain our management of them. But they're being supplemented with a growing understanding of the relevance of climate-related risks. Now, climate-related risks are often separated into two major categories: transition risk and physical risks. So the physical risks relate to the physical impacts from the shifts in climate patterns, For example, increased extreme weather events, such as cyclones, hurricanes, floods, or higher temperatures which are causing rising sea levels or chronic heat waves. Now, the physical risk arising from biodiversity loss is less well understood, but appreciation of its importance is growing. And I think the earlier panel session really helped draw out how the evolution in thinking in this area. Now, when these physical risks crystallize, in addition to the obvious terrible human impact, there's a material financial impact for insurance companies, investment companies, and that's also what we were touching on earlier. There is a school of thought out there that analysis and mitigation of physical climate change risk needs to be boosted by the financial services sector collectively. So secondly, transition risks. These relate to the impact of transitioning to a lower carbon economy. Changes in policy, technology, markets to address climate change mitigation and adaptation requirements are bringing both risks, but also, we'd like to stress, opportunities. That's always the flip side. Every time a regulator says risk, you can also think opportunity or reward. To bring some colour to what this actually means and how it might affect your businesses here, I was going to cover 4 examples. Now, we've already started to see the increase or the potential increase of increased litigation, legal risk. So this is, for example, where businesses fail to sufficiently disclose climate-related risk or adequately adapt to climate change. Secondly, of course, we've all been observing heightened market risk as the supply and demand for certain commodities, products and services shift. Thirdly, there's the technological disruption and innovation which is gathering pace to support our transition to a lower carbon, energy-efficient economic system. And this innovation in technology really brings with it both risks and rewards. We are seeing the development and use of, for example, emerging technologies into renewable energy or battery storage. And we're aware that there are already Guernsey funds that are investing in this area and financially benefiting from it. And fourthly, there's the substantial reputational risk if your business holds yourself out as being green or sustainable when indeed it is not. Now, the term anti-greenwashing or greenwashing may have only become more mainstream in the last few years. The principle that underlies it is part of the legislation and rules of the Commission, the regulator, since our inception. It's nothing new. At its core, the prevention of an action against greenwashing is part of protecting investors from loss due to dishonesty and malpractice. We ran a consultation on proposed measures to counter the risk of greenwashing earlier this year, and we've decided to implement policy changes as a result. But I'll not steal William's thunder because he's going to cover more of that in a minute. Part of our function as a regulator is to look over the horizon and evaluate emerging risk areas that are going to affect the bailiwick's finance sector. And the twin crisis of climate change and degradation of nature are, in our minds, 2 key such areas. Now, we consider that for the bailiwick to remain a jurisdiction of high quality and high standards, we need to ensure that our licensees, the local regulated businesses here in the jurisdiction, understand these risks that they are facing now, will continue to face, and mitigate those risks effectively. But we know it's not an easy path. We're all struggling with the lack of consistent terminology, the seemingly never-ending number of new standards, thought pieces, or webinars that we must dial into or follow becomes overwhelming. And crucially, our understanding of risk, I think, is going to always be hampered until we have more consistent, comparable data. Now, we think we're seeing a shift towards a low-carbon, more nature-positive economy. But this is also part of a long-term process. And so very consciously, the GFSC as the regulator here have concentrated our efforts on what we hope are carefully considered changes that promote long-term adaptation and long-term policy development. The opposite, if you like, of knee-jerk regulation. Finally, as I prepare to hand over, all of this progress in the bailiwick isn't happening in a vacuum. We need to keep an eye on international developments and ensure that we're in line with global standards. To do so, the GFSC is a part of various international organisations, to name just three, part of the UN Sustainable Insurance Forum, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures Forum, and the Network for Greening the Financial Services System. We think it's important that we prioritise resource to participate in these groups because it pays dividends. It ensures that we, Guernsey, are at the table when new policy is formed. We're at the table when new risks are being discussed, identified. I think picking up on the panel session from earlier in terms of regulators talking, I think it's also important to observe the importance of global regulators working together because we are here in Guernsey as a Guernsey regulator, but we need to join up more widely across the landscape. And frankly, we think to stay as a relevant high-quality jurisdiction, we need to be on the front foot of sustainable finance and hence have joined these groups. So I'll hand over to William.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And we've been talking a lot about sustainable finance, but as Emma said earlier in her session, it is important to break things down into actually actionable steps, into projects which can actually be done, and to go beyond talk and to do about action. And this is what we at the Commission have been trying to encourage for the past few years. Now, can I have a show of hands, please? Who has knows all about our initiatives over the last few years in this space? Okay, a few of you. Pity it's not more, because then I could get rid of 5 minutes of my speech and save you some time, but there we are. In terms of our approach to helping create a supportive environment for green finance, we've very much taken a Chicago nudge approach. We understand and appreciate Guernsey is a jurisdiction of choice for both investors and fund managers. Thus, we've not sought to manufacture a long set of administratively burdensome rules, which might be argued, at least in the shorter term, to have a limited impact on environmentally sustainable outcomes. Rather, we've adopted an approach of gentle encouragement and facilitation, highlighted the need for the mainstream of finance to follow the early adopters, and offered graduated mechanisms to encourage them to do so. To canter through a few of them, we reformed our Code of Corporate Governance to create a focus on long-term corporate planning to help firms adapt to COP26 requirements. The long-term known is that we're going to have to reduce the negative impacts of our economic and social activity, which damage they do to the natural environment. So we amended our Code of Corporate Governance last year to ask boards to consider the impact of climate change on their strategy and risk profile, and when they judge it appropriate, to make appropriate climate-related disclosures. We did this in part because we know what's coming, and we want our firms to think about it, rather than be surprised when disclosures probably become mandatory across the developed world. We've also started asking supervisory visits since then about how firms are thinking about climate change, and we've found in Guernsey genuine engagement on the topic as first steps are made by most boards, with some going a little faster than others. There's also sort of internal changes ourselves. It's not just something we're asking those we license to do, but also something we're thinking about a bit. We've started making climate-related disclosures part of our annual accounts this year, and we've given staff a green pension option for those who wish to invest their pension savings in an environmentally sustainable way. And we've shifted some of the Commission's investments into more sustainable assets. We continue to make environmentally operational improvements, and some of you will have seen that grouse in an earlier slide which was on the visit to a site in Scotland, which we've been afforesting. And I was very glad when I went up to see whether the trees actually existed last month and whether they were still alive, to find that not just a grouse. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't fly away from me. And then I realized she got lots of chicks with her. So I think it's a sign that, at least at this stage, our afforestation has been, as discussed earlier by Ollie, environmentally friendly with lots of broadleaf stuff, which should hopefully attract a good set of biodiversity. Then, probably most well known, there's the Guernsey Green Fund. We established this back in 2018 when investments in the environment were still a bit like the Wild West. And there are a few scandals about greenwashing which were shaking the confidence of investors as well as the public. So we constructed the Guernsey Green Fund to try to create confidence that in the bailiwick you could invest in green assets and know they were actually green. We think that at the time we did it, the Guernsey Green Fund was the first label given and supervised by a statutory regulator. And right now, as Gillian mentioned, our green fund assets total approximately 5 billion. We also spend some time making sure that the funds holding the designation continue to deserve it. And last year, we carried out a thematic review to assess compliance, and we're happy to be able to report to the public that Guernsey Green Funds appear to be invested properly in appropriate assets with no indications of greenwashing. We've also taken a lead and introduced a green insurance capital regime, make it easier for insurers to invest in green assets. We've got a thriving insurance sector in Guernsey with more than 600 insurance entities. What does our green insurance regime do? Well, it leans against a certain degree of actuarial conservatism in the insurance industry about holding green assets, which may, strangely enough, not have a 30-year track record, which of the sort habitually used for risk modelling by some. Our regime makes ultra clear that we have a positive, rather than a negative view from a capital requirements perspective, of insurers who include green assets within their long-term investment portfolios. I think it's fair to say, when I talked about this regime to some of my fellow international insurance regulators a few years ago, I nearly got shoes thrown at me. But it's fascinating now to see that both in the EU and UK, they're also moving towards having regimes which have a positive view about green assets. And it's nice to have done a little bit to have led the way on that score. But that's quite enough history. What about looking to the future? The future is clearly about looking at nice trees in nice parts of Scotland and then something called ISB. So what do we mean by that? Well, we have, as Gillian noted, been closely following international developments, especially those made by the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISB. It's issued an interesting exposure draft on climate disclosure in March this year. Now, we know this is still a draft, and there are definitely imperfections that need to be ironed out before this evolves into a useful standard. So what are we doing? We're keeping an eye on development, and when we think it's reached a level of maturity that makes it workable, we'll closely evaluate examine its value for the bailiwick, taking into account how and when international standard setters and larger jurisdictions choose to adopt it, before seeking to reach conclusions on it for Guernsey in conjunction with other actors. So that's a sort of one of the future developments. Now, going more forward to today, we've recently taken a fresh look at our Guernsey Green Fund regime, and I'm happy to announce here and now that we're expanding the green criteria in the Guernsey Green Fund regime to include the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, technical screening criteria for activities contributing to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And please don't ask me to repeat that. Why are we doing this? Because it allows for greater alignment with the EU, thus avoiding fund managers in Guernsey with the EU exposures having to comply with two distinct standards, because we do care a lot here about minimising the administrative burdens of regulation or maximising the policy outcomes. And we're also updating the current green criteria to include the latest version of the Common Principles for Climate Mitigation Finance Tracking. These are developed and used by a group of multilateral development banks. We're not at this point, to offer reassurance, removing the old definitions, as we wish to provide an opportunity for our green fund sector to consider whether their funds comply with the renewed criteria before determining if it's appropriate to withdraw the original green funds criteria and just simply leave the new renewed standards there. So that's, I suppose, what we're doing with the Green Fund. Secondly, as Gillian noted, we have done some consultation on anti-greenwashing guidance, and we're now publishing an expanded version of the Conduct of Business Rules with a guidance note clarifying our expectations on the transparency and the truthfulness of investment claims. We're slightly doing this on a precautionary basis in order to stay within the peloton of international finance. And I'm pleased to say that we don't actually have any evidence of greenwashing among our licensees at present. And then finally, and probably most importantly, we're today launching a new part of our Guernsey Sustainable Funds regime, the Natural Capital Fund structure. This isn't designed to be a dewy-eyed fund structure only suitable for those who would otherwise be willing to donate their money to environmental charities. If people are prepared to give away their money for free, then that's great, all in favour of it, but there's only a limited number of people who are prepared to do that. What this is designed as a structure that allows full-bodied, with-profit investment managers to invest not just in the dark green businesses, but also in imperfect companies which may currently do environmental damage, and to work with those companies to significantly reduce the environmental damage they do over the average, perhaps 10-year fund life, thus making a very measurable contribution to the draft COP15 goals, which we hope will be properly agreed in Montreal in December of this year. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to sit down, and we'll look forward to discussing with Josephine and with Gillian precisely how we hope this natural capital fund structure can help Guernsey make a meaningful contribution to making a more positive climate in the world for nature. Thank you.
So thank you, William and Gillian. That's really insightful and very exciting, William, to hear that announcement. I think we, all very pleased to hear that first step forward with the Natural Capital Fund. So can you tell us a little bit more about it, fill in some of the detail for us, Gillian?
Sure. So I guess it's good to appreciate this is part of our ongoing commitment to sustainable funds frameworks. We already have the Guernsey Green Fund, and similar to the Guernsey Green Fund, the Natural Capital Fund is an overlay to our existing funds framework. And it's a designation that's provided by the regulator to provide certainty and assurance to investors in what's within that fund. The way it works, I'd like to think, is almost like a four-step process here. Number one, you need to have a collective investment scheme. You need to authorise or register as a Guernsey fund. And then you get your overlay, your designation as a natural capital fund. You seek to come to us for that. There's no fee, by the way, for this additional overlay. It's an extra. So the first step is you have your fund. Second step, we're looking for prospective natural capital funds to have set out their objectives of their investments, of their fund, to be nature positive or to significantly reduce harm to the natural world. And those objectives need to be aligned with one of three existing credible frameworks. Those are the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals 12 to 15, the EU Taxonomy for Environmental Objectives, C to F, of which I can quote if you really would like to know, or thirdly, the Convention on Biological Diversity Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework 2030 Action Targets, all of which is going to be on our website as well, so you can follow it up. You get your fund, you set your objectives in line with those frameworks. Then thirdly, the governing body of the fund, so the fund board, and we very deliberately targeted on the governing body because we think they're the people who know best what's within the fund structure and the investments, need to set targets, science-based natural capital targets, how they're going to meet these objectives. And then fourthly, lastly, create a credible framework of policies, procedures, controls to assess progress and measurement against those objectives and targets. Then the governing body submits documentation to the regulator on a periodic basis so that we can observe how those targets are going.
So why natural capital specifically?
I think because it's become apparent, I think partly from Guernsey Finance feedback when they went to COP26, partly from other conversations, that it is the other big challenge. And I think it's very hard. It was at a sort of an NGFS, Network Green Financial System, which is the regulatory gathering to talk about environmental stuff, with Deutsche Bundesbank last week. And there were several people in the crowd who said, we shouldn't be doing this nature-based stuff at all. We should just stick to climate change, because climate change is easy. We all know it's about carbon and, fix that. And this nature stuff is complex. I think it's partly because it's complex. It's a good thing for Guernsey to be doing. We're good at doing complex things. We're good at doing things flexibly, which I think is something which bigger regulators and bigger jurisdictions find it difficult to do. And I think it's an interesting place where we can actually make a difference by doing something slightly different from the mainstream. What we're setting out here is not a fund. This isn't about risk management per se. It's about having a useful investment vehicle to make useful investments which actually really do reduce pollution in rivers, reduce harm to nature. And I think it's a niche where we can use our agility to hopefully make a difference for the planet.
Okay. So we have the Guernsey Green Fund and the Natural Capital Fund. Why have both? Why not just extend the remit of the Guernsey Green Fund?
So I think we've been very conscious that these are twin crises, and they're both addressing often overlapping but two distinct problems. And there are different methodologies involved, different valuation, and the characteristics, it didn't lend itself to simply an expansion of the Guernsey Green Fund. I think we also have been very conscious of the vast funding gap in the natural capital space, and so we felt it was important to bring specific attention to that as a separate designation. The name is it?
I think I'd add that there is mostly, I think almost invariably, doing good things for nature will help with climate change. There are, however, some climate change investment strategies which are not necessarily that nature positive, and I think it's important to understand the juxtaposition between those two things. I mean, this business of using wood pulp to power stations, technically, very technically, you can argue, because the wood pulp is sort of sustainable, that's climate change positive. I think you have to take some quite heroic leaps to believe that that sort of thing is actually nature positive. And then I also think that things like covering large swathes of hillside with solar panels, well, I'm offering these examples because these were examples we were discussing with other regulators last week. Yes, that might be quite good for clean electricity generation, but again, it's not necessarily nature positive. And I also think you can have a very precise set of definitions for the Guernsey Green Fund, and we do. I've just announced a new one, but it's quite precise, it's quite well defined. We all know we're doing tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, tick, tick, tick. There's a methodology. Natural capital is much more niche. Am I going to try and eliminate or radically reduce the pollution from this gold mine in this river, from these polluting factories, or am I going to try and work out how we can restore some damage which has been done to this coral reef? It's quite niche-y, and trying to do those niche-y things within a fund structure which is primarily designed for climate change is, I think, difficult. And I think having a separate designation is probably quite attractive to a slightly different investor base.
But we can take away that you can have both designations for the same fund.
Yes, yeah, we're conscious that there are actually some Guernsey green funds currently that where it might be very we've already looked at them, and we think we could see a case, should they wish, to have dual designations. We can also see others where the best is really just Guernsey green funds, and we've had some approaches from others where it might be more a natural fit to be in the natural capital fund.
So could we look at the business case then? What would be the perceived value of the designation?
So this was something we considered as part of our consultation process for the Natural Capital Fund, because there's really little point of the regulator producing something if no one's ever going to use it. Some of the feedback we got through the consultation was that this would enable some funds to access a different investor pool, a different pool of investments and investors. I think it's that broadening of an investment base that we have seen as we're evolving our understanding of the impact of nature loss. So businesses have also evolved from understanding it's not just about climate change, and so they're looking to reach out and extend their investor base, which we think this facilitates.
Yeah, and I also think it's useful to hopefully have a brand which has got, as it were, some statutory underpinning that we will be keeping an eye on what the fund managers are actually doing in a world in which there's a plethora of verifiers. We were told in the consultation feedback and in the pre-consultation we did with a number of significant environmental actors in the UK that having trusted verifiers would be useful. And I think in the rules we've published on our website, they should have gone off about 10 minutes ago, while the Commission won't be a verifier, the Natural Capital Fund designation does have an expectation that verification is built in, and with that there's a form of anti-greenwashing monitoring and due diligence. I mean, essentially for us to make sure the processes are legitimate, but what we haven't done is try to say, this is how you must do it, because frankly, nature-based finance is too complex for that. So rather than having a static list of how you should do the verification, this will be evaluation on a case-by-case basis to try and ensure that processes are appropriate for the given structure and its investment strategy. Our research has also showed there's substantial greenwashing concerns, not just amongst the retail investors, but also about finance sector professionals. And we're trying to address this with the new fund structure. So expect the verification we've asked funds to have to create a regime in which financial actors can place trust that actually sort of creates confidence and assures anybody interested in helping nature that this is a fund structure that will actually do what it promises.
And what wider impact do you hope that the fund structure will have?
Well, I mean, we all sit here all day. We come to work to make our crust of bread, but it's actually quite exciting if you can at the same time do something which actually pushes the planet in a positive direction. So I'm certainly hopeful that through this fund structure we can make some small difference, firstly for investors, but also for the planet, and try and we heard earlier the stats about what a small percentage of the overall funds going to nature actually come from private sector sources. Now, we all know all the public purses around the world are stretched to breaking point, especially with all the bad stuff which is happening in Ukraine, Chinese zero COVID policy constraining supplies of goods and stuff, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So we think this is a really good opportunity to try to help more private sector funds come into funding productive, profitable projects, which also have nature conservation, nature protection at their heart.
Well, look, thank you both for sharing this with us. We'll obviously be watching with interest to see what the uptake is on this new fund, but I think it's a fantastic initiative given everything that we've been speaking about today. So, thank you for taking that first step as a regulator as well.
Do you want to do Slido questions?
Slido question, yeah.
We're doing Slido, are we? Good.
I think there's one final Slido question for you. I don't know if that's coming up on the screen.
Or do you need to log in? Let's have a
But the question is, what do you think
look.
about third-party, yes, there we go, verification for natural capital funds?
There we are, some teasing
There we
up
go.
questions.
I mean, we'll probably have a quick discussion on this one, William and Gillian, if that's okay with you. We won't bring the other ones up that you've done today. Let's just have a quick chat on this. So, I mean, you touched upon third-party verification briefly there, William. Perhaps you could expand on that, and given that the results of the question seem to be it's absolutely necessary, for the large part, 75%.
Well, if one thinks about the nature of funds investing in assets which are not necessarily listed in a liquid market, there is always a degree of marking to model in terms of working out what the valuations of those funds might be. And there's also going to be with natural capital funds an added dimension of, are you actually doing what it says on the tin? Okay, say you've bought into this polluting factory in XYZ country and you've got a share which gives you a seat on the board and so forth, so you've got some influence. Are you actually making meaningful progress in reducing the amount of pollutants which that factory is putting into the river next to it? Now, you as the fund manager with the best will of the world are always incentivized to say that it's sunny side up, aren't you? Because that keeps the paychecks rolling in and the fund valuations high because you're getting a premium for investing in nice things and so forth. But what happens if it's not true? That's where I think third-party verification becomes very important. And I hope that we as the Commission will then provide a third layer through doing thematics of the funds to check that the third-party verifiers haven't, and of course this could never happen, be influenced by the paychecks they're getting from the fund managers to come up with rather sunny side up reviews of how much good the funds are doing. So there's a few checks and balances built into the system. For us, we don't pretend to be experts in nature conservation, but we are moderately expert about working out when somebody's trying to tell us things which aren't quite true, and we hope we can bring that into play when assessing how good the third-party verifiers are in due course.
We included this specifically in the Slido questions because it's, for the eagle-eyed amongst you, it's one of the policy areas that's moved a little bit as a result of the feedback to our consultation paper. So we're now in our final rules, we're saying our expectation is that there will be a third-party verifier for the reasons William set out. But I'd also add a caveat that we've decided there's not one size fits all here. There is the opportunity, if you're a part of a firm that has got access to very expert in-house resources, perhaps elsewhere in a group, or that expert party elsewhere in the group, you could draw on their expertise to provide you with that verification. It doesn't always have to be a professional services firm, because we think the bulk probably don't have that level of knowledge and maturity, but there are some instances where they can. So that is another option.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. And Steph, now over to you.
So thank you both to Gillian and William for that discussion. I'm over the moon to have another world first for Guernsey in the natural capital space, and I really can't wait to see some of the innovative funds achieving this kite mark. It really is an amazing example of real-life local contributions to mitigating climate change, and yet another example of the island as a world leader and a force for global good. We're really proud to have a regulator pioneering here in Guernsey, even if I'm trying to kick them off the stage early. Rupert will pick things up again to end the day before our really exciting drinks reception, and I definitely encourage you all to walk down with us to see the art exhibition and grab a drink as well. I'd first like to take the chance to thank you all for coming today. We are very grateful to all of our sponsors for their support of Sustainable Finance Week. Today's headline sponsor is PwC. To close out our schedule of speakers for today, I'm pleased to welcome PwC Director Ali Cambray, who will give today's headline sponsor address. Over to you, Ali.
Good afternoon, everyone. that picture's about 10 years old. It's quite funny. So, yeah, a little bit more wrinkly in the flesh, but there we go. So, yeah, thank you so much to everyone. So, yeah, I'm Ali Cambray. I lead ESG, sustainability and climate change services here in the Channel Islands. And on behalf of PwC, I can say it's been an absolute privilege to sponsor this first day of the Sustainable Finance Week today on this critical theme of biodiversity. I'm sure I can hopefully speak for many of you in the room to say that we've been so inspired by the quality of the debate all afternoon, and I'd really like to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers so much for your contributions. There's also been a number of fringe events today, and thank you so much for everyone who have played a part in those, giving us all real food for thought. I can't possibly do justice to the breadth and depth of the fascinating discussion that we've had today, but I just thought I would highlight two things that really stood out for me this afternoon. The first one is this really well articulated need that came out in the panel for this twin track approach when we think about biodiversity and finance. This greening finance and financing green. I think that's so powerful, and the combination of that was just really helpful to hear today, so thank you for that. And the second one, actually, if I was to draw out one key theme that came up time and time again today, it's this theme of collaboration and partnerships. And I'll just give you a few examples, 3 examples of ones that really stood out for me. The first one was partnerships in the architecture that we need for addressing nature and biodiversity challenges. Partnerships in the development of standards, of frameworks and tools, of data, a really, really key one, and regulation and things like fund regimes. So really, really key there around the architecture. The second one then is around partnerships in financing. And we heard so eloquently from Emma right at the beginning of the session around this real need for conscious and deliberate choice about where we put our public sector finance and how you use that to leverage blended private finance and really look to unlock that private capital that's going to address this huge and potentially growing financing gap for nature and biodiversity. And the third one then is around partnerships on the ground. And we heard, again, some really fascinating examples from both Emmas and others, actually, of these types of practical examples of innovative collaborations on the ground. I learned around habitat banks, which I really like the concept of, and what that means to really implement change on the ground. So thank you for that. Oops. As a kind of career sustainability professional, when I started my career, so back to the wrinkles, over 20 years ago, working on environmental policy for the UK government, we could only dream of discussions like this rich, tackling biodiversity and the nature crisis in the international finance industry arena. But today, I think, is real testament to just how far we've come around awareness, conversation and desire to take action as an industry. Helped in no small part, of course, by some really robust and impactful global scientific and economic analysis we've heard about today, around the value of natural capital to business, and around the threats, of course, arising to our environment, society and economy if we don't act, and the many emerging innovative solutions and actions, again, we've heard today. However, of course, we still have a really long way to go, as was also touched on. Some of you may have joined our PwC Fringe event this lunchtime, in which we discussed in more detail the case for action and how tools like the TNFD framework can help. Our role here at the PwC ESG team here in the Channel Islands is very much about demystifying complexity for our clients and trying to support practical action by the industry here. It can feel really overwhelming, right? Where do you start if you're an investment manager, if you're on the board here, if you're in a corporate business here? Where do you start? What do you do? So with that in mind, I just wanted to leave you with 4 practical no regrets tips from our Fringe event earlier today that everyone can take away from this session and hopefully consider applying in your organisations, in your investment portfolios, whatever type of business you're working in at the moment in relation to nature and biodiversity. So the first one is around thinking governance, assigning roles and responsibilities for nature-related risks and opportunities, increasing your board's oversight and understanding of their relevance throughout your operations, your investments, or your portfolio companies is really key. Governance of sustainability, or ESG, and climate issues is something we regularly challenge our clients on here in the Channel Islands, and our last industry survey suggested that over 70% of asset management boards now discuss ESG issues at least once a year. But I'm not at all clear yet to the extent to which nature features in those discussions. That's takeaway one. The second point, kind of quick tip to think about, is around think tools. There's no need to start from scratch on any of this. So do explore and look to utilise available tools that have already been developed to assess dependencies and impacts in terms of your relationship with nature and biodiversity, and to think about those risks and opportunities. The TNFD do provide a list of tools on their website, or please come and ask any of our team. And in particular, I think it's really important to think about how to use tools to work out which types of nature risk are most material to your particular portfolio, your particular supply chain, your particular operations. So that's really about where can you have the greatest impact and where are there the greatest dependencies. You can't do everything at once. Focus on where you can really make a difference. The third one is then one point that came up earlier and was really quite key in our Fringe event, which is around think location. Nature-related risks and opportunities are really highly specific to their location. So what specific ecosystems are your activities or those of your investee companies interacting with? How important are they? What are the specific challenges? Are they water stressed? Have they been degraded? If you don't already know, perhaps soon is the time to start thinking about collecting that spatial, that geospatial data for your operational and for your or for your investee company assets and your portfolio companies. So just food for thought there. And last but by no means least, back to this point around collaboration. Do share your views. Do engage, help create the TNFD. They've got these beta versions and this opportunity for feedback. And of course, do continue to, I think it's fantastic, the relationship we have here with the regulator here, do continue to engage and participate, because that theme of collaboration is absolutely key, as I said. Finally, those of you who know me will have heard me say several times before, I'm absolutely a firm believer that international finance centres such as Guernsey have a real opportunity to play as a conduit for finance, for nature-positive, climate-positive solutions. So I really hope today has been thought-provoking and informative, and I really look forward to seeing how we collectively move forward on our collective sustainable finance journeys. Thanks very much.
That's great. Many thanks, Ali. Absolutely fascinating and inspiring and inspirational start to the week. We've heard about the business opportunities in biodiversity and its relationship with climate change. And we're delighted that the GFSC have announced a new world-first sustainable finance product, Guernsey's Natural Capital Fund. It's heartening that the issue of sustainability, which is so vital to our future, is deemed important enough to warrant input from so many different angles, as demonstrated by the vast range of topics and speakers that we've heard today. And we're only just getting started for the week. Before we close for the day and reconvene for drinks and networking, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their support of this event. PwC as today's headline sponsor, and thanks again to Ali Cambray for her address. The International Stock Exchange for our first ever carbon offset sponsor, as well as registration sponsor OSIA, coffee sponsor KPMG, and to Locate Guernsey, our exhibitor sponsor. Thank you all. Not forgetting the Duke of Richmond Hotel for hosting us this week, and of course, the Financial Times as our media partner. It's very important for us to know what you thought of today's event so that we can make them even better in the future. Therefore, we ask if you'd kindly take a moment to complete our survey online, which will be sent to you in due course in a post-event email. We'd also appreciate if you could place your lanyards in the bowls on the registration desk on the way out to let us know how you think the event went. If you want to know more, we have an extensive library of literature on Guernsey's role in sustainable finance, including our new transition report that I mentioned earlier. You simply head to our website and click either the Literature or the Resources tab, from which you'll be able to filter to the correct topic, or simply scan the QR codes on the event banners, which you'll see dotted around the venue, which will take you where you need to go. To end the day, we've something a little special for you. Please join us as we head down the road to the Royal Court for a drinks reception with a difference. Not only will you be able to network and discuss the events of today, but we're also displaying a nature and biodiversity-themed art exhibition hosted by our friends at Art for Guernsey. It'll also showcase Guernsey's connection to Renoir and to Victor Hugo. Soundtracking the exhibition, we have music composed by Alice Boyd. Her music exhibition is inspired by her artist residency at the Eden Project. She built a device that detects changes in the electrical current across a plant's leaves and spent time in the rainforest biodome collecting musical data from the plants. These changes were translated into musical notes that are played by synthesizers and musical software. So that's it for the day, or at least here at the Duke of Richmond. I'd now like to close proceedings and ask you to follow the Guernsey Finance team down to the Royal Court for networking and drinks. The event starts in about 10-15 minutes, so we look forward to seeing you down there. Thank you very much, and that closes day one.